Before we get started and I introduce Chuck, a couple of things, housekeeping things. First thing is we always thank Dale Noble and his wife Tina. Dale was the former president at Denison, and they left an endowment for us, gave us an endowment to support a fund, actually it's not an endowment, just a fund, to support programming, which makes all these wonderful programs available and makes them available for free. So that's the one thing. Now, the next thing is that you are sitting in a room with art, which is unusual at the Historical Society. We're about artifacts and historical objects, not about art necessarily. But these wonderful art objects are all by an artist named Michael Young, who was a professor at Denison for more than 30 years. His widow, Marilyn, is a dear friend of the Historical Society. She's a volunteer and a supporter, and she donated a group of Michael's works to be auctioned for benefit of the Historical Society's endowment. It really is, in this case, an endowment. This is about our future, so that we're here for generations of people that follow us. So I'm going to hand these little postcards out in a little bit, because this is how to connect. The big auction is June 4th, but it's already online. We're working with Apple Tree in Newark, Apple Tree Auction Center, which, of course, Sam is on our board and is very kind to help us. So I wanted to tell you about that. I also wanted to mention, I have to look at all of these things. We are going to sell books at the end of the evening. If you do not have Chuck's book, this talk is based on the most recent pocket history. It's number 9, I believe, that Chuck wrote for this. When was it published? Last
December.
Like in December. So it's brand new this year. If you don't have it, you want one. Chuck is going to do a author signing. He's going to do a book signing for us. So that's really exciting if you need one. And cash is wonderful for us, but we do have a way we're going to work through the office, and Kim is here. Our treasurer is going to help us figure out how to do it online when we get to that stage. So let's talk about this. Of course, is Memorial Day weekend coming up. Is perfect for our presentation. Is anyone here from, I'm going to get the post number wrong, post 398? Okay, so you know the American Legion does our memorial celebration every year. They do a fabulous job. We encourage you to participate this year if you get a chance. If you're around on Monday, there's a parade, and then we end in Maple Grove, and there are speakers. So if you've never done that, we encourage you to participate. So now tonight's program is entitled Memorial Day in Granville, 1873 to 1936. Chuck, Charles, we always call him Chuck, but his actual name is Charles A. Peterson. But Chuck arrived in Granville in January of 1996. He took over the editorship of the Granville Sentinel, which is how many people met him here, a position that he held for almost 20 years, just shy of 20 years, to taking an early retirement in October of 2016. He became involved with the Granville Historical Society in 1999 when he agreed to become our secretary. So the secretary became the secretary of the Board of Managers. Once retired, he agreed to serve as board president for 2 years in 2017 and 2018. He is currently our at-large board member, chairing Publications Committee, and he has inherited, because of his skill as an editor, he's our editor for the Historical Times, the Society's quarterly publication. Chuck is also very active at the Rotary Club of Granville, where he also served as secretary and was president. He is not an Ohioan, I'm sorry to tell you. He seems to have been born in Wisconsin. And he was, in 1974, graduate of the University of Wisconsin at Whitewater with a degree in journalism. Without further delay, Chuck. Yay!
Thank you very much. Before I get started talking about the coming Memorial Day ceremony on Monday, the speaker for that is Jeff Gill, who is with us tonight in the back row there. So it should be a good one. Okay. Tonight,
lights. Are we going to do anything else with the lights? What do you want to do?
Doesn't matter.
We're good? We'll all stay awake this way? Okay.
Tonight I'll talk about how the idea for writing this pocket history came about, which discusses the early history of the Granville Memorial Day event. I'll talk about some of the early speakers and what they had to say, detail the stories behind the 4 individuals for whom chapters were dedicated, talk about the roles of women and mentioned the last two Civil War veterans in Granville, and conclude with a few examples of what keynote speakers said late in the last century and in this century. So, the first Memorial Day program I attended, as you heard, would have been is 1996, covering it for the Granville Sentinel. And I was immediately impressed with how it was organized, with the various speakers, especially the keynote address, along with the music, student recitations, and the participation by the sponsoring Granville American Legion Post 398. Since then, I think I've only missed one program. And while I was covering these events for the Sentinel, I was always happy that getting a news photo from the event was the easiest part of covering it. Every time you turned around, there was a red, white, and blue patriotic scene unfolding. And that was from 1996. That's still my favorite. The decision to organize and write this pocket history started with an effort to accumulate as many Granville Memorial Day keynote addresses as I could find. I acquired several of the recent ones while covering the event, as my handwriting for note-taking gradually became more and more illegible. I was forced to ask several speakers for copies of their talk, and they usually handed the paper copy right to me. And looking back at the list of keynote speakers in recent years, I knew that a handful were still in this area or they had family. And after contacting them, I was able to get electronic copies from those who had saved them, although unfortunately not all were able to find theirs. At the Historical Society, as I talked about the research for speeches, or the search for speeches, it was pointed out to me that the Granville Times had published some of them during its run from 1880 to 1941. And sure enough, I was able to find several there. And in our archives upstairs here, two speeches turned up, including a pamphlet with the 1878 address, the earliest we have. As of now, we have just 34 of 150 keynote addresses given, but the search continues. And we'll add to it each year, of course. As I looked through the Granville Times editions, I slowly began to find and file articles about Memorial Day services, both previews of the programs with the speakers named along with the other participants, and follow-up articles, some in more detail than others, but usually rehashing who gave speeches and how patriotic and outstanding they were. Also reading these articles, I began to notice certain names of individuals who were regulars during these programs, primarily Dr. Edwin Sinnott and the Reverend Charles Baldwin, and seeing the name of the Reverend Thomas Shepard as a keynote speaker in 1882, already knowing his experience in the Confederacy's Andersonville prisoner of war camp. These individuals all stood out as significant among the personalities with involvement in those early decades. Additionally, the name of Francis W. Shepherdson, who was much younger than the aforementioned trio, also came to the forefront. Altogether, these individuals and these early decades began to form a compelling story. Today, we have accumulated a Memorial Day archive of like 300 pages of speeches, news articles, photos mainly of speakers, about 5 newspaper editorials, poems related to the topic, and what I term auxiliary speeches, which were significant orations in addition to the keynote speakers. And we have the long list of keynote speakers compiled for the first time finally. There's only 5 that I haven't been able to find so far. But as this vast archive grew, I began to notice that much of the material in it represented the time period from 1873, the year of the first Memorial Day program here, to 1941, the year the Granville Times stopped publication, shortly after Memorial Day. We have so much material representing the first 7 decades of this event compared to the 8 decades since. And amazingly, much of that material covers the years 1873 to the turn of that century. Part of the reason for the dearth of material from 1942 to 1970 was the absence of a Granville newspaper, believe it or not, during those years. As I said, the Granville Times stopped publishing in 1941. The only newspaper in town between then and 1970 was the Granville Gazette from 1948 to about 1952. The Granville Sentinel started in 1970, but its coverage of Memorial Day was spotty at best until 1996, when detailed coverage became more routine. Therefore, the decision to outline the sometimes very moving early history and evolution of this important Granville event was obvious, with so much information available. I chose the time period 1873 to 1936 because in that last year, the Granville area lost its last two surviving Civil War veterans, Albert Norris and Howard E. Griffith, whom we will speak of a little later in this talk. Some of you, I'm sure, know, as you're doing research, experiencing the jubilation of uncovering a badly needed factoid you didn't think you'd find. That was the case in trying to firmly establish the first year that Granville held a Memorial Day observance. There was confusion about when that first program occurred due to the inaccurate math at the top of the Memorial Day programs handed out each year, where it traditionally stated how many years the event had taken place. We did have 4 strong hints about what that year was, which are outlined in the pocket history, but I still wasn't satisfied that we had it nailed. Until I was in the archives one day, not long before the first official draft of the book was finished. I'd been looking through a box of material about Granville Memorial Day that includes speeches and an impressive collection of programs attained through the years, going back to the early 20th century. As I was walking toward the archives door to leave, I looked to my right, where I knew there were boxes of old newspapers, including the Licking Monitor, a monthly newspaper that preceded the Granville Times. Maybe it had an article right ahead of the 1873 program confirming it was the first. But if the Monitor had it, we don't have the April or May editions from that year that would have previewed it. So I continued to dig further, finding a box with editions of the Newark American, a 4-page weekly paper that also circulated in Granville. After looking at 4 editions, I ascertained that the local news was always on the back page. So looking through 4 or 5 more editions, I came upon the May 23rd, 1873 paper. There on the back page, starting at the bottom of the 3rd column and continuing at the top of the 4th, was the following. We are requested to announce that the 30th of May, Decoration Day, will be observed in Granville for the first time. To say I wanted to do a backflip would be an understatement. Physically unable to do so, however, I called something like 4 people. I think they were head archivist Teresa Overholzer, collections manager Cynthia Court, both of them here. Then board president Heidi Drake and Cynthia are here, and Granville military historian Kevin Bennett with the happy news. This was truly the found needle in the haystack, and I must add here that our archives, under Teresa's guidance, is a place where many, many needles in the haystack can be found. It's full of great information. I have to credit one of my book editors, who's also here this evening, Lynn Boone, for catching that mathematical error I have already referred to, which can be seen at the top of the 1919 Memorial Day program, stating it was the 46th, when in reality it was the 47th. Those responsible for making that calculation back then, and including myself 100 years later, approached it as if it were an anniversary. If they had printed the word anniversary on that line, it would have been accurate, but anniversary numbers don't include the very first event. That's the trick. Okay, and just to be sure she was correct, and realizing my own horrific shortcomings in doing math, I printed this list of every year starting 1873 to the present and counted them one by one. She was right, and I'll be forever grateful, Lynn, for your ability to recognize that miscalculation. The earliest Memorial Day keynote speakers were either Civil War veterans, judges, attorneys, ministers, or academicians, many of the latter, of course, from right here in Granville at Denison University. In fact, for Granville's very first Memorial Day event, then known as Decoration Day, the speaker was Louis Ezra Hicks, professor of natural sciences at Denison. Later on, starting in the 1940s, military personnel and politicians began to be the go-to people for the keynote address. The Denison Collegian, a student publication, actually reported what Professor Hicks talked about in that very first address. And this is something the Granville Times and maybe other newspapers just didn't do much of, saying what the speaker talked about. The Collegian wrote, he reviewed the results of the war, which were the preservation of the Union, most important of all, the abolition of slavery, the triumph of free institutions, and the vindication of our national character. As a sideline, it's interesting, Professor Hicks during the 1880s was a proponent of making Granville the Licking County seat, taking that away from Newark. As you see, it did not happen. The earliest full speech we have in the Historical Society archives was given in 1878 by Captain Charles Sinnott, brother of Dr. Edwin Sinnott. Sinnott named each and every Granville soldier who died as a result of the Civil War, providing 2 or 3 sentences about each of them, including their backgrounds and the skills in which they excelled. This was a long list, 62 names, including those buried away from Granville, many in cemeteries in the South. A couple of examples of the men Captain Sinnott described were Lieutenant E. Thomas, enlisted in Company D, 22nd Regiment, September 3rd, 1861, was promoted to orderly sergeant of his company and was promoted to first lieutenant July 14th, 1862, mustered out at Camp Denison November 18th, 1864. Lieutenant Thomas was a good officer, prompt in all his duties, and kind and indulgent to his men. Also, Caton Hill, enlisted in 3 months' service and re-enlisted in Company C, 76th Regiment, December 9th, 1861, and was mustered out July 1864, and died at Granville March 22nd, 1866, of consumption. He was in quite a number of battles: Fort Donelson, Shiloh, Siege of Corinth, Vicksburg, and others. He was noted for his bravery and reckless daring. Decades later, in 1964, Granville Historical Society Board President, the Reverend William C. Stewart, who was pastor of Centenary United Methodist Church, gave the keynote address, naming many of the same men Captain Sinnott listed. He opened, "Who is there to remember who gave the last full measure, their lives? You can you recall one or two of the names?" And most people, I'm sure, couldn't. I personally hope that sometime in this century, that list of names is read again at a Granville Memorial Day event, establishing a worthy tradition. Among other Decoration Day speeches from the 19th century, the Granville Times in May 1893 printed a segment of the previous year's keynote address given by the Reverend George B. Simons of the Zanesville Baptist Church. This speech was popular among readers and listeners because of the reverence he showed for the American flag. In part, he said, "Grand old flag, thou hast been the inspiration of as brave and loyal hearts as the world has ever known. Thou hast led the advance of soldiers living. Thou hast shrouded the lifeless forms of soldiers dead. Thou art the ocean into which all springs and rivulets of patriotism flow. Poets have sung thy praises. Thousands have given their lives to rescue thee from the ruthless hands that were trailing thy sacred emblems in the dust. Thy folds are stained with the blood of our kindred," and so forth. I don't know if those were his own words or if he was quoting someone else, but they were beautifully expressed. Dr. Charles L. Williams, a trained pastor and professor of rhetoric and English literature at Denison University, was the first to have his Memorial Day lectures published in their entirety in the Granville Times in 1894 and 1897. He said that life spent in a righteous cause is never lost, saying as follows: "Every man that fell in defense of the federal union still lives in a most important sense. In whatever branch of the service he fell, he lives, is present with us today, goes with us wherever we go, and watches the risings and fallings of our patriotism. He did not fall defeated, he fell triumphant and became a larger part of this national life of ours than he had ever been before." In both of his speeches, he talked of an invisibility of the soldier. In 1897, he said, "The most important things are not the things that can be seen, but those that cannot be seen. You can see a man's actions, principles, and convictions are nonetheless real and potential because they belong to the category of invisible things. What is a man? He not only has a soul, but he is a soul. Is it any less real because it is invisible? All the truth a man has discovered or learned and assimilated is part of him." Among the 4 personalities featured in this pocket history with their own chapters, the first of these examines the Reverend Thomas Shepard, whom I regard as perhaps most deserving of our reverence considering his unimaginable experiences at Andersonville. 2 years ago, in the Historical Times, our quarterly research publication, I managed to assemble what might have been the content of the keynote address he gave in 1882. This was fairly easy because all of the paragraphs in this imagined speech were his own words from his own writings. In the first of those writings, titled "At the Academy," which was a compilation of Shepard's recollections by his son James for Denison University, Reverend Shepard states this motivation for joining the Union Army in 1862 at the age of 28. "My ancestors were strongly opposed to human slavery. This was a war which promised to destroy that great evil. Should not I bear part?" 2 years later, Shepard found himself in this horrific position, as he described in an account published in the book. This is a really long title: "Andersonville, a story of rebel military prisons, 15 months a guest of the so-called Southern Confederacy," which we obtained from the Rochester Museum and Science Center in Rochester, New York. He wrote, "About 2 p.m., June 23rd, 1864, I, in company with about 200 unfortunates, was turned like a wild beast into the pen at Andersonville, Georgia. There were given to us no shelter, no cooking utensils, no soap, no kettles for washing our clothing, no system of police to prevent crime or secure cleanliness, nothing save what we carried on our backs. They provided a 15-foot stockade and bloodhounds to prevent our escape, guards to shoot us if we crossed the deadline." But what was so impressive, Shepard immediately sought like-minded religious men who were already trying to meet the spiritual needs of the prisoners. As he wrote, "I spent much time in search of a religious company, but without success until the night of July 8th, when, attracted by the singing of hymns, I found a large and attentive congregation gathered in prayer and conference meeting. I was deeply impressed by the sight, as the faint light of the feeble fires fell on their emaciated forms, clothed in rags, begrimed with dirt, and disfigured by disease, their faces pinched with hunger, but radiant with the presence of God." Was such an in-depth look at the horrors of the Andersonville prison really the topic of his 1882 speech? Following the Civil War and major wars in which Americans fought since then, few soldiers came back willing to talk about their experiences. He may have only touched on the subject and instead talked about the merits of winning the war. But in speeches thereafter, he did address Andersonville. The December 17th, 1886 Granville Times reported that Shepard gave a speech to the brand new Granville Historical Society that was titled, "What I Saw at Andersonville." The article recommended that every Grand Army of the Republic post in the nation should schedule Shepard as a speaker. One intriguing discovery also published in the Granville Times was Francis W. Shepherdson's tribute to Shepard upon his death in 1912. Shepardson recalled as a boy of about 8 years old, playing outside Shepard's home with the minister's son, Will, asking or perhaps just wondering why Will's dad, then in his 30s, was in college. I suggest that if they ever make a movie based on this pocket history, what I just described with those two boys should be the opening scene. Francis Shepherdson's tribute to Reverend Shepard included the following observation. "I do not believe that I shall ever forget Mr. Shepard's voice. There was a certain gentleness and softness in it in which everyone noted as he lectured or preached. In private conversation, it held one's close attention. And no one who had the fortune to listen to him as he talked to his friends and neighbors will forget that charm in his manner and bearing, which made him so genial and companionable an associate." Shepard's fellow veterans tried in vain to get state and federal approval to officially name him the chaplain of Andersonville. Papers were prepared to do so in Ohio and given to Shepard, apparently, according to one account, but Shepard himself declined to send the material to the State House. And a similar effort in Congress also failed. Okay, can you go get that red glass of cup of water back there? Sorry. Regarding Dr. Sinnott, if there is anyone in Granville history that I would want to talk to, it would be him. I think he was, in my estimation, pretty amazing. Thank you. The series of Memorial Day speeches he gave during the 1880s and 1890s, not the keynote address, but one directed strictly at his fellow Civil War veterans, repeatedly reflected the warmth he felt toward them, having experienced as many of the horrors of the war as they had. The Granville Times obituary upon his passing in 1902, noting his leadership of the Granville Soldiers and Sailors Association, described how the organization's members knew well, quote, "the warm clasp of his hand, the soundness of his advice, and the genuineness of his love." Dr. Sinnott served in the Civil War as a surgeon for approximately 2 years, first joining in September 1861, according to a handwritten document penned by his son-in-law, Charles White, which we have upstairs in the archives. According to White's writing, Dr. Sinnott was forced to return home the following spring because of failing health. But his fellow Granville residents then persuaded him to return to duty that summer to specifically aid Granville soldiers in the field, which he did. Sinnott then re-enlisted in August 1862 upon hearing of the need for more medical assistance. In December of that year, he organized a hospital department in Nashville, Tennessee, and was ordered to take charge of it. It served 1,000 disabled soldiers, according to White's account. In his 1882 address to the veterans, which I found only a month ago up in the archives, the tone was significantly different than the more upbeat words that came in later years. It may have been because in September of the previous year, President James A. Garfield died from an assassin's bullet. Sinnott made clear his feeling about the assassin, Charles J. Guiteau, when he exclaimed in this oration, "I affirm the judgment of the jury that they decided that justice required that the said Guiteau be hung until he is dead, dead, dead." That, in fact, occurred exactly a month later on June 30th. But the terse tone of this speech might also have been both to, as we look upon these things today, unload the horrific experiences he experienced himself, up till then suppressed, or he may have wanted the general public to know what their soldiers experienced when he described situations such as the ground shakes and trembles, and the shells go shrieking into the swamp to cut trees short, to hunt out and shatter and mangle men until their corpses cannot be recognized as human. Or, a round shot or shell takes two men out of the rank as it crashes through, grape and canister mow a swath and pile the dead on top of each other. He concluded this no holds barred description by saying, historians write of the glory of war, burial parties saw murder where historians saw glory. But Sinnott ended this 1882 talk with two soothing poems. The first titled Sleep Old Pioneers by Will Carleton. In 4 instances in the verses, he changed the word pioneer to volunteer to relate it to the veterans present. Sinnott's address the next year considered some of the more positive memories of Army life, saying, yes, my comrades, we all had but a few joyous times in the Army. Did you ever experience greater happiness and feel more like giving out through every avenue of expression, your soul's delight, than when after a severe clash of arms, the rebels were put to flight and victory declared for the Stars and Stripes? I can almost see you with uplifted caps giving the hip hip hurrah. But how the scene changed, where soon thereafter you are called to perform the sad duty of caring for your mangled and dead comrades, who but for a moment before were fighting by your side. Yes, there were very many trying times, as well as not a few glorious days to cheer you onward during our Army life, but with all the privations included there too, there is not one of you but rejoices at the thought that you helped to preserve this free and noble union from dissolution. In 1886, Dr. Sinnott proposed that a monument be built to remember the efforts of Granville's Civil War fighters, saying, our ex-soldiers are fast passing away. Our numbers are yearly diminishing, and in a few years, those of us who have participated in the exercises of Decoration Day will be silent in death. In 40 years from this time, what will there be in Granville Township to perpetuate the memory of over 300 of her noble sons who left home and all of its comforts for $7 a month and be shot at, while those who sent us poor fellows there got $8 a day? An election issue to build such a monument, actually a memorial hall, in fact made the Granville spring ballot in April of 1889 that sought approval to raise $5,000 in tax revenue. In today's dollars, $170,000. Amazingly, it was defeated, 273 to 128. As a result, such a monument did not appear in Granville until the 21st century, but there are 2 now, recognizing soldiers of all wars. Sinnott in 1888 also praised the establishment by the state of Ohio of a soldiers and sailors home for Civil War veterans in Sandusky, passed while he served in the Ohio Senate. He said, boys, we never need to go over the hill to the poorhouse. In addition to his involvement with fellow veterans in Decoration Day, Sinnott also sponsored a bill to establish the Ohio Board of Health during the 67th General Assembly. In a letter to the Senate President promoting this bill, discussing his experiences and hearing about, quote, proceedings detrimental to the best interests of the public, end quote, Sinnott wrote, the intention of this bill is to provide a more uniform standard of medical education in this state. We propose to provide by law that all persons who expect to practice medicine and surgery in this state shall be properly qualified therefor. The health of citizens of this state should be guarded by law against the encroachments of all hypocritical pretenders and falsifiers. The bill was passed in 1887. It should be noted that Dr. Sinnott had 7 brothers, one of whom died from his injury in the Civil War. In the long list of the 150 keynote speakers for the Granville Memorial Day program, there are, as I said, 4 years during the 1870s for which we do not know who delivered the address. I wouldn't be surprised if Dr. Sinnott had given one of those early keynotes. It's too bad Reverend Charles Baldwin isn't a household name nationally. Our Historical Society archives has an innumerable number of his sermons given during his 27 years as pastor of the First Baptist Church here, along with several other speeches, diaries, and letters, including letters he wrote to a contemporary describing his hair-raising experiences while he served during the Civil War. Someone here could probably author his complete life story. To say Reverend Baldwin was a regular at Memorial Day services would be an understatement. If he wasn't giving the opening prayer, he was giving the benediction, or vice versa. And just before this pocket history went to publication, I finally found that he had indeed given a keynote address for the Memorial Day program in 1899. And as was the case with Dr. Sinnott, I say he probably gave one of those 1870 speeches where we draw blanks on who were the speakers. However, and not surprisingly, Reverend Baldwin was also a major player in the Memorial Day sermon events, which started during the mid-1880s and ended during the 1920s. These sermon programs were held aside from the community Memorial Day observance and involved 3 of the churches at Granville Square, Baptist, Presbyterian, and Methodist, which took turns hosting the event. We have 2 of Baldwin's speeches given at memorial sermon programs and the newspaper accounts of a handful more. In his 1891 sermon, published in the Granville Times, Baldwin wrestled with a confliction of war versus the teachings of Christianity. He said, "A Christian soldier." This phrase may seem to some to be paradoxical. How can a Christian be a soldier or a soldier be a Christian? What harmony exists between the trade of war and the gospel of peace? He answered the question this way. Well, let the Bible answer. In the Old Testament, we find the warrior recognized as among the servants of the Most High, in certain cases expressly commissioned and equipped for a battle in the name of Jehovah. Joshua stands beside Moses and David beside Samuel as equally authorized to use the sword and the spear in the divine service. But this was under the old dispensation. If that sounds harsh, Baldwin then turns to the New Testament and it's, quote, "Gospel of grace, and what do we find? Again, a warfare and a warrior. Christ is the captain of our salvation. The Christian is to be a good soldier of Jesus Christ, who is to fight the good fight of faith and endure hardness." One very valuable source of information regarding Baldwin were letters he wrote to a college friend, Willie, while Baldwin was in the Army, describing a range of experiences from the boredom of spending time at Folly Island at South Carolina to his more jarring encounters in combat later as his unit moved further south. Baldwin seemed to be proud of having these experiences, according to his letters, especially when he told Willie in 1864, following a battle in which he was mounted on his horse next to his commander. Not a little proud was CJB, his initials, of this position. How those bullets sing. You remember the tune very well. Additionally, Baldwin, in these letters, was critical of decisions made by military leaders. Following a battle near Jacksonville, Florida, in which the Confederates forced the Union Army to retreat, Baldwin wrote to Willie blaming the Union officers for poor judgment and tactics. He also made reference to the same outlook in his 1899 Memorial Day keynote address, when the Granville Times reported Baldwin as he credited the boys of 1861 to 1865. None could appreciate, as could they, the wonderful daring exhibited by our boys at the front, and also many of the egregious blunders committed. In this 1899 address, Baldwin, according to the Times, called for maintaining a standing army, quote, to keep in readiness for any call 100,000 well-disciplined troops. Baldwin was pastor at the Baptist Church, as I said, for 27 years, a considerable tenure both in that day and probably today as well. Charles L. Williams of Denison was quoted upon Baldwin's death in 1921, praising his oratorial talents, stating, "He had a wonderful insight into spiritual truth. He was a seer, and what he had seen, he could say in language the most simple and beautiful. Dr. Baldwin was a broad-minded man, utterly free from petty secularism, a loyal Baptist. He was more. He was a Christian gentleman. Nothing in personal character of this great preacher was more prominent or more beautiful than his charity. Always ready to bestow commendation, he was equally ready to withhold censure." A chapter in this pocket history was dedicated to Francis W. Shepard's son, even though he was not a Civil War veteran, having been born during the war. However, this 1882 Denison graduate holds the record of delivering the most keynote addresses, 5, including each year from 1933 to 1936, just within the purview of this pocket history's 1873 to 36 time period. Shepherdson was a scholar. You can see his long list of vitae. He graduated from Denison and later from Brown University, coming back here to teach at the Young Ladies Institute, which his father and mother had taken over. He was also a charter member of the Granville Historical Society at the age of 23, and he was a charter member of the Granville Volunteer Fire Department. To say Shepherdson loved Granville would be an understatement, and Granville apparently loved him just as much. He wrote several poems about Granville, including Along the River Road, Granville, I Love Thee, and Lovely Little Granville. Meanwhile, in a preview article for the 1912 Memorial Day event, where Shepherdson would give his first keynote address, the Granville Times wrote, "There is no name more dear to the people of Granville than that of Shepherdson, and no more true, able, and exponent of that name can be known than that of Frank, by which his Granville and Newark friends knew him." Shepherdson also penned the poem They Are All Gone in 1932, as the number of Civil War veterans had dwindled to a bare handful. Like Dr. Sinnott, Shepherdson worried that the sacrifices of Granville men who fought in the Civil War would be forgotten. In his 1933 speech, he said, "What about Memorial Day of the future? Will the great heritage of the years which Granville has be gradually forgotten? New families came into the community who know not the stories of years gone by. The appeal is made for loyalty to a noble heritage, loyalty to the idealism for which they were willing to fight and for which some of them gave their lives, loyalty to the principles which lie at the basis of American life." Shepherdson seemed more optimistic about the future of Memorial Day in his 1936 speech, however. "Ever since the Granville observance of Memorial Day began, now 63 years ago, there has been one entry in every line of march: children with flowers. We do not know what the next reel will show, but we may look forward to the unknown future with confidence so long as the children of Granville, with flowers of memory, recall the storied past." In Shepherdson's 1934 oration, titled Granville's Prideful Memories, his description of the Memorial Day gathering in Maple Grove Cemetery and why so many were present was as beautiful as any description before or since, if not more so. Into this lovely cemetery, so dear to every Granville heart, where the trees and the green grass and the white stones whisper of eternal peace. We have come to this morning to think back upon times of fierce, tumultuous passion when war alarms were heard in our land, to think back with memory and with pride. We have come to do honor to those who in years gone by shouldered arms and marched away to fight for a cause which appealed to every fiber of heroic manhood in them. Shepherdson was also known for his dedication to the college fraternity realm, serving as national president of his own fraternity, Beta Theta Pi, until his passing in 1937. In fact, he was on his way to a fraternity convention when he collapsed and suffered a fatal heart attack. The Granville Times news story announcing Shepherdson's passing called him America's greatest fraternity leader. A fellow Denison graduate, Osmond C. Hooper, wrote of Shepherdson in a tribute, "It is no wonder then that he lived Granville, for Granville lived in every cell of his being." I included a chapter on the involvement of women in the early Memorial Day programs, at first thinking their contributions were minimal and almost condescending by today's standards. However, a closer look reveals this to be not entirely the case. The undisputed star during these early decades was Lucy Van Kirk, a longtime leader in the Licking County Women's Christian Temperance Union and editor of its publication. Van Kirk gave what I call, as I said before, an auxiliary address given in addition to the keynote address, both in 1895 and 1896. And fortunately, the first one was published verbatim in the Granville Times. It was very impressive, titled "The Hero of the War." She discussed how it wasn't the military leaders who deserved the credit for winning the war, but instead, she stated, "We think the hero of the war was the volunteer soldier who enlisted without thought of fame or money, and but for the pure love of country and human liberty. He left his all, home, mother, often wife and children, endured the tiresome marches, the tedious petty duties of camp life, bore the brunt of battle, starved in prison pens. We stand aghast when we view what the common soldier endured during those days of the war." She continued, "Now it is a beautiful custom to meet once a year and scatter flowers over these heroes' graves, but that won't buy bread and butter for the living, nor will it ease a dying veteran's last moments to know that a grateful country will strew flowers once a year upon his grave if he also knows that leaving a wife and children on the cold charity of the world, we owe them more than this, something more substantial. The common soldier, the hero of the war, fought the battles and ended the strife that gave us the grandest government on the face of the whole earth. And not until every veteran who enlisted draws a pension, and an ample one, will our nation be doing her whole duty." I should point out, we could not find a good photo of Lucy and felt bad about that, but we'll keep looking for that too. Other contributions by women included the dedication of the new gate at the lower end of the old colony burying ground, made possible back then by the Granville chapter Daughters of the American Revolution in 1912. The dedication program was made a part of the Memorial Day program that year, even though it was held inside due to rain. That gate, by the way, was repaired and rededicated just last year. Women of the community came through again in 1926. By this time, members of the Soldiers and Sailors Association sponsoring the Memorial Day event dwindled to about 10 members, all of an advanced age and no longer able to organize the ceremony. It was the Granville tent Daughters of the Veterans who took it over thereafter. Well beyond the 1936 stopping point for this pocket history, we were able to ascertain what is almost certainly the first year that a woman gave the Granville Memorial Day keynote address. That was 1993, when Captain Cynthia Friel, a member of the Army National Guard stationed in Newark, who unknowingly to most was the first female to do so. She still lives in Licking County, and she is here tonight. Cynthia, would you stand up or raise your hand? Thank you for attending. Since then, in this century, 4 more women have given the keynote speech. Participation by minorities during the early years of this Granville tradition appears to be sparse, but still noteworthy. One standout was William Meredith, who gave a speech at the 1886 program in addition to the keynote speaker. Meredith apparently came highly recommended, having graduated from Denison that same spring. The Denison Collegian once again comes through with some great information when in its March 25th, 1885 edition, heaped praise on Meredith's participation during a Denison literary and debate organization event, calling his oration most highly appreciated by the audience in a program that otherwise was regarded by the Collegian only as good. Meredith is another example of the needle in a haystack found in our archives. I happened to be paging through one of Reverend Baldwin's diaries, and on one page, apparently regarding the 1886 Memorial Day program, he wrote down Meredith's name, and next to it in parentheses was the word colored. That's not a term we would use today, but I'm sure if I would, I'm not sure I would have picked up that fact, that important detail, if I had not seen that. Also in this chapter is mention of the Jackson brothers, Samuel and Wiley Jackson, both born into slavery. Sam was a member of the Union Army's 5th Colored Troops Division, and Wiley joined the Army's 14th Regiment Rhode Island Colored Heavy Artillery Unit. Sam was married to Edna Jackson, who later gained fame as the house mother of Denison's Sigma Chi fraternity. A lot of you know this, known by her nickname, Auntie Jack. Sam lived and worked in Granville, but we're not sure about Wiley's place of residence, although the Granville Times twice published a list of Civil War veterans that included Wiley as being from Granville. Sam was also included in the 1888 photo of the Granville Civil War veterans on the front cover of the Pocket History. Wiley might have been in that photo too, but had he not passed away 3 years earlier. Changes in the leadership of the Granville Times during the first 3 decades of the 20th century resulted in no complete Memorial Day or memorial sermon speeches being published. However, another needle in the haystack moment emerged when the 1906 speech given by Newark attorney Charles W. Montgomery turned up in a box of Montgomery family papers in our archives. Over 6,000 words, this one gave Captain Sinnott's 1878 oration a run for its money in length. And I've blown them both away because I think mine is 8,000. Sorry about that. Montgomery was just 25 years old when he gave that speech, although the 1880 speaker, Denison alumnus Harry H. Carpenter, is still the youngest, having given his 1 year after his graduation at the age of 21. Montgomery, later a judge in Licking County, recalled how his first impressions of Memorial Day were made during Granville's program when he was a child. Incidentally, the same childhood memory was related at last year's Memorial Day program by a keynote speaker, Second Lieutenant Ryan Dickerson of the U.S. Marine Corps, and others before him had the same experience. Montgomery acknowledged the Granville community's impressive response to the call for soldiers for the war between the states, in particular, which meant no one had to be drafted from this village and township. He stated, according to the statistics, Granville, during that war, furnished 35 more than her quota and boasts the distinction of being the only township in the county where no drafting was needed. There was a total enlistment of 175, the enlistment of Licking County being 3,952. He added, the war record of the citizens of Granville has been a good one. In each and all of the country's wars has Granville been represented. 8 Revolutionary soldiers lie buried here. This township boasted 40 soldiers in the War of 1812, several in the war with Mexico, and a very great number in the Civil War. Montgomery borrowed from Abraham Lincoln when he said, it is very fitting that we meet here today in this village of Granville very fitting that we now commemorate that those who lived here did and what those who lived here did and what their lives meant. This town and township are entitled to our respect at the mention of its part its citizens have taken in this country's wars. We involuntarily bow our heads and remember, for as in that great Gettysburg Address it was said, men will little heed or long remember what we say here, but they cannot forget what they did here. It is fitting that we recall the men who were here and what they did. The Granville Times exclaimed in its follow-up coverage that Montgomery, quote, delivered one of the most brilliant and patriotic addresses, appealing strongly to the old soldiers who were present, end quote. The Times always said that the speaker was great, but in this case, it was with much more exuberance than usual, so he must have been good. Montgomery also gave the 1926 address, this time as a veteran of the Great War, which we know now as World War I. Members of the Montgomery family have told me that they have an archive of their relatives' papers. I've notified them to let us know immediately if they ever find that 1926 speech. I think it would be fascinating to read. Skipping to 1930, we don't have his entire speech, but the Granville Times finally started reporting what speakers said, and for Memorial Day in 1930, Granville's Welsh community had the honor of one of their own giving the keynote. He was William Harvey Jones, then a Newark attorney credited with a considerable knowledge of Granville history. Jones took a different approach in his oration, according to a report in the Granville Times. Quoting the article, he laid upon the altar of the soldiers, memory, an eloquent wreath of praise and gratitude. But he called the attention of his hearers to the fact that patriotism is not a service confined to the battlefield, but is a consecration of self to community and country. He cited the sacrifices of the prisoners who carved a commonwealth out of the wilderness of the Northwest Territory, and specifically of the Granville fathers whose ideals and industry made Granville what it is today. The article continued, paraphrasing Jones, those who, in times of peace, wrought to make true their dreams of freedom, justice, and security, were also patriots whose claim upon posterity's gratitude should never be ignored. As I stated earlier, the Granville area lost its last two surviving Civil War veterans in 1936. Albert Norris, age 93, passed away on January 1st at his home in Granville. As if participation in battles and being shot at and serving time in one of the South's prisoner of war camps weren't enough, Norris had the misfortune of being on the steamboat Sultana on the Mississippi River following a prisoner exchange in March 1865. On April 27th, just after the boat left Memphis, a boiler exploded, killing 1,600 on board. Norris was one of only 600 survivors. He was sleeping on the level above the boiler and fell through a hole in the floor and was severely burned. He jumped into the river and managed to hang on to a cracker barrel before he was rescued. In his later years, he moved to the Granville area and operated a general store at Union Station until retirement. He served as president of the Granville Soldiers and Sailors Association in 1918 and was village assessor in 1925. The Granville Times tribute to Norris read as follows. A dour day, weeping skies, a flag-draped coffin carried along a flag-draped decorated street. Veterans of Spanish-American War and World War bear the coffin to the grave. American Legion men reverently fold up the Star-Spangled Banner, a word of prayer, then echoing across the Raccoon Valley the clear notes of their trumpeter sounding taps. We don't know as much about the very last Granville area veteran, Howard E. Griffith, who died September 29th, 1836, at the age of 90. He lived in the Welsh Hills just over the McKean Township line. He did attend the 1935 Granville Memorial Day service and was recognized by Speaker Francis Shepherdson for being there. The Granville Times wrote this in tribute to Griffith. Something has passed from Granville, perhaps never to be felt here again, in the going of Howard Effingham Griffith. He was a welcome presence on every Memorial Day when Granville patriots met in Maple Grove to pay tribute to the boys in blue. When the Civil War veterans were seen, and now probably that sight will not come again to a Granville boy or girl. During what I call the dead period between 1942 and 1978, we only have the two keynote addresses from 1964 and 65 by the Reverend William Stewart. What we're missing here, unfortunately, is how speakers of that era adapted the Memorial Day theme to their own times. We have only 4 keynote speeches between 1979 and 1996, one of them incomplete, but they are great examples reflecting issues of the time in which they were given. As luck would have it, the Granville Sentinel did publish in entirety the keynote given in 1979 by Denison Professor Conrad E. Ronneberg. Does anybody remember him? Ronneberg, who spoke about the nuclear disarmament negotiated at the time between the United States and the Soviet Union in the Second Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty talks known as SALT. Ronneberg stated, soberingly, the nuclear weapons of today are 1 megaton weapons, each with, and remember we have over 9,000 of them, a destructive capacity of 1 million tons of TNT. There is no escaping the conclusion that use of thousands of nuclear warheads today would mean the utter destruction of much of the world's civilizations. It should be noted that Professor Ronneberg and the late Ted Barclay, who many of you remember, are the last 2 Denison faculty members to give the Granville Memorial Day keynote address, a considerable departure from those early decades of the ceremony. In 1980, then Navy Reservist John Reeb, a Granville native and a graduate of the U.S. Navy Military Academy in Annapolis, Maryland, questioned the moral status of the nation at the time, this just following the Watergate scandal, saying, in every age there has been corruption and moral decay, but somehow the basic principles have not been affected. But now, in my judgment, our national principles are being eroded. Where we were once the moral standard of for the world, just as our dollar was the monetary standard, we are now being shown how far we have slipped. One moving keynote address that I was able to cover and witness occurred in 2000 when Donald R. Hendricks, a Vietnam War veteran, said this, reminding us of the terrible reception many war veterans of that area experienced when they came home. You have done me a great honor today, asking me to speak here. I feel like I'm finally back. Finally, Martha Neff Kessler, a Granville native and Denison University graduate who recently passed away, brought a unique perspective in 2015 from serving with the Central Intelligence Agency as an expert on the Middle East, South Asia, and political Islam. She had this striking observation in her keynote speech. I have traveled around much of the world in my career, briefing presidents, kings, and meeting average citizens, peasants, and the wretchedly poor. With only a handful of exceptions, the rest of the world has a way of life that lacks the strength, freedom, and well-being that make our country so unique. It is not only freedom of tyranny, foreign ideologies, and despotism that makes us the people that we are. It is our certainty about the strength of our armed forces. And in our most recent Historical Times, which is available here, I reprinted her entire address that year, and a couple people have already expressed how they appreciated seeing that. So with this, I will close. Thank you very much.
I know we
Yes, Jeff.
With all your studies of all of these previous addresses, how long do you think an address should be?
Oh, not as long as mine today or those other two that I mentioned. Yeah, 6,000 words. Okay, any other questions? His father and mother did that. Yeah.